We open part 2 with the actual plan to cover the landing in the San Carlos waters area. Brigadier Julian Thompson, who commanded 3 Commando Brigade, gave out his orders on HMS Fearless on the 13th of May. The enemy situation was assessed as follows. First of all, the air side. 7 Pucara aircraft were estimated to be on the island, but all Argentine fighter bombers were assessed as being capable of operating from the mainland, albeit with a limited loiter capability over the Falkland Islands themselves. The ground forces were estimated at approximately 11,000, 9,600 Army and 1,700 Marines, and their deployment was assessed as follows. First of all, in the Stanley area, as far west as Mount Kent and Mount Challenger, a joint force headquarters, 5+ Army and Marine infantry battalions with supporting arms, and in the area of Moody Brook, just outside Stanley, logistic units and support helicopters. In Port Louis, there was an unknown number of helicopters and troops. At Fitzroy, this was a possible staging area and a possible location of an air mobile reserve of 1 infantry regiment and 1 commando company plus helicopters. In the area of Goose Green and Darwin, 300 to 500 troops with an infantry company, air defence and air force elements. San Carlos, Port San Carlos and Ajax Bay were reported free of enemy troops. In the area of North Arm Settlement, 60 to 70 troops, but unconfirmed. Port Howard, the headquarters of 3 Brigade, an infantry regiment and an artillery battalion. In Fox Bay, an infantry regiment plus engineers. In Pebble Island, naval air elements and aircraft. Now the mission was to land at Port San Carlos, Ajax Bay Complex, and establish a beachhead from which to launch offensive operations. It was to be a silent night landing in 3 phases. We'll now focus in on the San Carlos waters area. In Phase 1, 40 Commando were to land by landing craft and secure San Carlos settlement. They were to establish a defensive position on the reverse slopes. 4-5 Commando were to land by landing craft and secure the Ajax Bay complex, and again they were to establish a defensive position on the reverse slopes, covering the high ground to the west of Ajax Bay. That was Phase 1. In Phase 2, 2 para were to land by landing craft, and after moving to an FUP and start line, were to clear forward to Sussex Mountain Ridge, and subsequently prepare a defensive position in that area. 3 para were to land by landing craft and secure Port San Carlos settlement, and again to establish a defensive position on the reverse slopes of the settlement rocks. That covered Phase 2. You will appreciate that there were only sufficient landing craft to lift 2 major units at a time, hence the phasing. 4-2 Commando were to remain in reserve afloat and to be at 30 minutes notice to move from HR. The 2 troops of B Squadron of the Blues and Royals were to provide 1 troop in landing craft with 40 Commando in Phase 1, and the other troop again in landing craft, but with 3 para in Phase 2. Their tasks with both the battalion and the Commando was to exploit forward in the beachhead and to provide fire support if required, and observation. Phase 3 comprised the build-up. 4 batteries were to deploy from the ships in this phase, which would be as soon after first light as possible. The assaulting commandos and battalions had a battery each in direct support. T Battery from 12 Air Defence Regiment provided the Rapier Air Defence. They were to deploy in Phase 3 effectively at first light, and they were required to cover the whole of the beachhead. The grouping for each of the commandos and battalions that were actually going to do the landing are as shown on this slide. This particular slide shows 40 commandos grouping, however it's typical of all the assaulting units. To cover these silent night landings from a fire support point of view, 4 naval gunfire ships were assigned to support the task force. These were 4 frigates with 4.5-inch guns, and the assaulting commandos and battalion were assigned 1 ship each. In addition to these plans, it was also considered necessary for a diversionary attack to be made, and this was to be done by the SAS in the area of Goose Green. Subsequently, this plan was added to in light of the enemy being reported in the Fanning Head area. You will appreciate This position had a commanding view over the neck of the Falkland Sound, which leads into the San Carlos waters, and the SBS were tasked to take this particular enemy position out. Another change also took place. The brigade commander from intelligence gained was most concerned that the enemy might counterattack against the landings, and their most obvious route would be from the area of the Sussex Mountains. To counter this contingency, 2 para were ordered to land in Phase 1, and no longer in Phase 2, and establish themselves as soon as possible on Mount Sussex. Now that was a planned outline. D-Day at this stage was not known, and H and LRs were to be issued later. Subsequently, and in good time, D-Day was confirmed as the 21st of May, with HR being the time the first landing craft hit the beach at 0630 hours Zulu, and LR being the time the first helicopter landed at 1130 hours Zulu. You should bear in mind that local time was 4 hours behind. And if I could digress here for a moment to talk to you about times, which were a complete pain throughout the operation. On the way south on the QE2, we regularly altered our clocks 1 hour backwards until we got to South Georgia. That was fine. We had an hour's extra kip each time. When we got to South Georgia, we changed our clocks as we went on board the Canberra. When we got to San Carlos, again, we changed our clocks because the timing was different there again. Port Stanley, which is on the eastern end of East Falkland, was on a different time to the whole of the Falkland Islands, and in fact, actually, it was on the same time as the Argentine mainland. So as you can see, the timings were a total pain throughout the operation, and one's own personal administration left a great deal to be desired under the circumstances. Now, the Fanning Head attack went according to plan. The night of the main landing, 25 SBS men and a naval gunfire support team landed by helicopter. They pinpointed the enemy and brought naval gunfire down on them, then opened up with automatic weapons and 60mm mortars. The firefight lasted throughout the night, and at dawn surrender was called for by a Royal Marines interpreter, but confusion and enemy trickery led to a prolonged engagement which ended 2 hours after dawn, with the capture of 9 enemy, 12 others having been killed. They were equipped with 106 recoilless rifles and 81mm mortars, which were trained onto Falkland Sound. As you can see, they successfully rendered that particular mortar US. At the same time, the SAS diversionary attack on Darwin took place. This was a successful operation, not just from the point of view of numbers of enemy killed and equipment destroyed, but more so by the confusion caused, leading the enemy to think that the main landing was actually taking place in that area. Now, with these 2 sideshows going on, the task force shipping entered the Falkland Sound and into the San Carlos waters area totally unmolested by the enemy. The battalions then successfully loaded themselves onto the landing craft and in total darkness, with nerves very much on edge, moved off to their assigned beaches. Major Martin Osborne, who commanded Charlie Company of 3 Para, was destined to land at Port San Carlos Beach, and he can tell you of his experiences.
At 0930 Zulu, on the 21st of May, with my company, I threaded my way down to the dock inside HMS Intrepid. We were just some of the many helmeted and heavily laden figures, as the whole of our battalion threaded its way through a seemingly endless number of dimly lit bulkhead doors. As we boarded the landing craft, mortar rounds and grenades were thrust into our hands. And as the landing craft emerged, we realized for the first time that it was broad daylight. We'd been briefed for a night attack. War was living up to our expectations. We were put ashore by Fearless landing craft, which had already landed 2 Para, and they, for various reasons, mostly beyond their control, had been slower than anticipated, outloading from the MV Norland. As we moved away from Intrepid, we were able to orientate ourselves. Fanning Head was on our left, and it was surprising and not a little unreal to see arcs of tracer being exchanged over the landward shoulder of the hill, and the black cotton-wool puffs of smoke of the 4.5-inch frigate shells. Our soldiers stood in the landing craft, with all their kit on, and many of them refused to rest or kneel, having spent ages getting their loads properly adjusted. Ammunition loads at this stage varied from 50 pounds for a rifleman up to 80 to 100 pounds for a signaller or an 84mm man. And at this stage, remember, only the signallers were carrying Bergens. 30 minutes after loading, we approached our landing beach in Port San Carlos Bay. B Company were already ashore and appeared like ants swarming across the flat ground at the head of the beach. There was no firing, and with a mixture of relief and, on my own part, very little disappointment, we realised that the landing was unopposed. A Company, who'd gone in before us, appeared to be cross-decking to smaller landing craft, as the large one they were in had run ashore on a sandbank 50 metres short of the beach. Someone on the back of our landing craft called to me, seeing this, asked if I would like to try and get the company ashore outside the bay. This would mean a half-mile tab to the mortar line with the heavy ammunition loads, but in exchange for a dry landing in the cold but sunny conditions, it seemed worth it. At approximately midday that day, we were ashore and dry. A Company pushed through B Company and into the Port San Carlos settlement itself. B Company held the beachhead, and my own company, C Company, moved in advance to contact formation from sea level up to the 600-foot ring contour of settlement rocks, which was to be our home for the next 5 days. Before landing, a Sea King helicopter with an underslung load, and then 2 Gazelles with Sneb rocket pods, flew past us towards Port San Carlos settlement. This was surprising, as it was obviously forward to where we knew the battalion to be. It was only after landing that we heard that 3 of the 4 men in the 2 Gazelles had lost their lives when the aircraft were brought down by ground fire from 40 Argentinian survivors making their way back from Fanning Head. The enemy fled the settlement as A Company approached, and B Company was sent off in pursuit to the northeast as the enemy withdrew. But they were unable to catch up with the enemy, who reached their limit of exploitation at Windy Gap, who'd had 40 minutes start. For the rest of that day, we dug in on settlement rocks. The ground was soft, and despite being on top of a mountain, very, very wet. And where we couldn't dig down without building swimming pools, we built sangars for the soldiers to shelter behind. We had a grandstand view of the air attacks on the Navy and transport ships, who had landed us, as foot soldiers extremely relieved to be there, unscathed onto dry land.
With all the major units successfully ashore unopposed, that is where the brigade remained for the next 5 days. Considerable patrolling took place, and defensive positions were improved. It was now essential to get the brigade properly balanced logistically, and this proved to be no easy task, as you can imagine. The stowage plan, due to the rush to leave the UK, was anything but ideal, and the vast quantities that needed moving with the few helicopters and landing craft available would inevitably take some time. Added to this, the Argentine Air Force made its presence felt in no uncertain terms and delayed things even further. These air attacks and the effects they had need special mention, and Captain Ian Gardner will explain.
We faced a modern, well-trained, well-motivated Air Force, and if anything was going to beat us, it was going to be their air power. And obviously it was the Admiral's greatest challenge to ensure that it didn't. We assessed that their effectiveness was limited to daylight, which of course is one of the reasons why the landings were by night, and the disembarkation of rapier and blowpipe were of a very high priority. But once ashore, the troops were in a pretty good position, being able to disperse, dig in, and camouflage, and thereafter the juicy targets became the ships. And we, the troops on the ground, had the most spectacular view of the ensuing air battle. Our air defence system consisted of a triad of 22 Sea Harriers, ships equipped with gunnery and missile systems, and the land-based rapier and blowpipe. Additionally, a vast armoury of small arms sprouted from ashore and from ships, seemingly growing in number with each attack. And these were all loosely stitched together with a command and control system. And when I say loosely, I mean loosely. We dug in up the hill. When the enemy aircraft came over, we took cover all right, not so much from the enemy aircraft, but more from those dug in down the hill. The Sea Harriers were deployed over West Falkland on combat air patrol, about 150 miles away from the carriers which needed sea room for protection, and they were hugely successful. But they lacked early warning, and their Blue Fox radar was not good at looking down, especially over land, and in consequence a fair proportion of the aircraft they destroyed were shot down on their way home. But at least they didn't live to fight another day. The ships protecting the amphibious force were at a disadvantage too, and lack of warning and land interference with their radars and their missile systems meant that they were operating at their limits, but they too claimed 24 aircraft. And as you'd expect, these air attacks greatly affected the operations by slowing down the offload and making it imprudent to have too many ships parked in the anchorage at once. And this in turn affected logistics. We could not unload our stores, our ships, at will. And our efforts to balance ourselves logistically after our hasty departure from Great Britain were seriously disrupted. And the whole process was to slow our attempts to prepare ourselves to advance eastwards. And as the campaign progressed, the problems for the troops on the ground became more and more acute. For instance, the bulk of the quartermaster's stores for the three commandos were never actually unloaded at all, which meant that basic essential items such as boots, sleeping bags, water sterilizing tablets, clothes, ponchos, once lost, destroyed or worn out, could never be replaced. And by the time we entered Stanley, some 29 days after landing, a number of Marines had been able to continue only because we liberated substantial quantities of Argentinian kit, which, I may say, although it stank, was perfectly warm and perfectly comfortable.
For all of this, and the many interruptions to the logistic build-up, the time had now come to push out from the beachhead and onwards towards Stanley. With every helicopter being overworked, getting stores ashore, it was painfully obvious that the move forward, for the most part, would be solely by foot. The brigade commander formulated his plan and gave out his orders. 4-2 Commando were to reinforce the SAS, who by this stage had established themselves on Mount Kent. And that is what they did by helicopter over a period of days, due to bad weather and helicopter availability. 4-5 Commando were to march to Douglas Settlement, secure it, and be prepared to move forward by foot or by helicopter. They took Douglas unopposed, and in the event marched through Teal to Bluff Cove Peak, not to be confused with Bluff Cove, which is in the south to the rear of Mount Kent. 3 Para were to march to Teal Inlet and be prepared to move forward from there. They took Teal unopposed and marched on through Estancia House and went firm on Mount Estancia. 2 Para were to march to Darwin and Goose Green and capture them, and this you will hear about later. Because the brigade commander now knew that 5 Brigade would shortly be arriving in the San Carlos area, he felt able only to leave 40 Commando behind to guard the beachhead as the brigade reserve. They would later become the divisional reserve, and later still, 2 companies of 40 Commando were placed under command of my own battalion after the bombing at Bluff Cove. Now, to give you a feel for the much publicised marching, Corporal Steggles, who was with 3 Para, now takes up the story.
After 5 days of living in a trench overlooking Port San Carlos settlement, orders are at last received that we're to move. During the past 5 days, we've had a chance to sample the outrageous terrain of the Falkland Islands by the sending out of fighting and recce patrols. And all of us at platoon level are of the opinion that to send infantry across this type of terrain is a very slow task indeed. We've looked at the maps and seen the huge distance from ourselves to Stanley, and all of us have joked that being 3 Para, we're more than likely to be bloody arsed to march it. We all agree that helicopters are a must. Prepare to move. We stockpile Bergens and pack away rations. The battalion is to march to Teal Inlet. B Company is Point Company. Out come the maps. It's all of 27 miles to Teal. I look at my section. The eldest is 21 and the youngest is 18. 1 or 2 of them are already starting to suffer with the cold and wet, and a few of them have been complaining of sore feet. I brief them quickly and tell them at least on the march we're going to keep warm. Again we joke about marching all the way to Stanley and set off as Point Section. The going does not disappoint us. The ground is a permanent bog. Very soon boots are soaking wet. At the first stop to check maps, we change round the heavy loads. On we march. We've been on the march for nearly 5 hours when we eventually meet up with the commanding officer and the RSM at a river crossing. Well, all my lads ford across, up to our waist in freezing cold water, and on reaching the other side, everybody's amazed to find that the RSM appears to have dry boots on. Obviously, bloody walked across is the general opinion. We stop and make a brew. It's getting dark now, and there's still no sign of a fence line that we hope to pick up and use as a navigation aid. We set off again. It's dark, and progress is very, very slow. Men are continually falling and stumbling. A mist has come down, and a steady drizzle is falling. It's becoming harder for us to keep control, so we move into single file and march on. My own feet are now starting to ache a bit, and I check the lads, and everybody seems to be having this problem with their feet. The cold and wet is now getting at some of them, and it's getting harder for us to get them going again after each stop. Suddenly there's a shout at the front for a medic. One of the attached arms, a radio operator, has fallen down a pothole and damaged his leg. Well, a stretcher is brought out and taken to the front of the column, and the casualty is placed on it. But surely we all think we're not going to attempt to carry him all the way to Teal settlement. Well, we certainly tried. Lift, said the sergeant major, and 4 men curse and swear as they lift the stretcher and attempt to carry the casualty forward. But they in turn only go a few paces before one of the lads stumbles and the casualty falls off the stretcher. Well, this pantomime's repeated several times before, much to the relief of the casualty, a decision is made to leave him behind with 2 other men and for the remainder of us to crack on. At last we reach the fence line and we stop for a brew and a few hours' sleep. The wind and rain are now unrelenting, and we huddle together and share a brew. With no sleeping bags or ponchos with us, our chances of sleep seem pretty grim, but 1 or 2 of us manage a restless doze. All too soon, we're on the march again. We're no longer point section, and it's a case of follow the leader for hour after hour. 1 or 2 more of the lads start to fall out, but these in turn are left behind. All that matters now is for the battalion to reach Teal. All my section are still with me as darkness closes in, and we eventually meet up with special forces just outside the settlement. They inform us that the enemy have bugged out, but we carry out our plan and eventually march into the settlement in the early hours of the morning. We had made it, but at a price. 3 of my section can no longer continue due to the state of their feet, and I'm afraid the story's the same throughout the battalion. Tired, hungry, and frustrated at having missed the enemy, we dig in round the settlement and wait for rations and orders. And that night, it snows. Choppers bring in rations the next morning, and we start to shake out and look forward to a spell in defence. But it's not to be. An O group is called, and by mid-morning, we're on our way again. This time, the objective is a Estancia house. And suddenly the joke about marching all the way to Stanley is a definite possibility. Once again we march across the outrageous terrain of the islands, and we've left all our injured behind at Teal. Some of them we won't see again until we get home, and all these have been labelled war dodgers. We spend a freezing night in a gully and press on again at first light. My own feet are now so painful that we've started to pop the odd pain-killing tablet that we're carrying in our med packs. I'm afraid if we have to fight at Estancia, we could be a bit pushed, as 1 or 2 of the lads are in pretty bad shape. But once again, on hearing of our approach, our reputation obviously precedes us, and they retreat, and we march into Estancia without firing a shot. We move on to the high ground of Mount Estancia and dig in. To the east, on a clear day, you can make out Port Stanley. I look at my section. Tired, footsore, but no longer worried about the cold and wet or the enemy, as over the last few days we'd all learned how to live and survive on the Falkland Islands. In just over 4 days, we'd marched over 50 miles on 2 days' rations. And all this stood us in good stead for the remainder of the campaign. However, we no longer joked about marching all the way to Stanley, for we knew that within the next few days we'd be able to say that we'd done just that.
Whilst 3 para were marching east, 2 para were about to attack Darwin and Goose Green. Major Martin Osborne now takes up the story.
On the 24th of May, 2 para were ordered to carry out an immediate raid on Darwin and Goose Green. At last light, as the battalion moved off, the raid was cancelled. 2 days later, CO Tupara was ordered to attack Goose Green. In his orders, Lieutenant Colonel H. Jones' mission paragraph read, "Tupara is to capture the Darwin and Goose Green area." The plan was for a 6-phase attack, beginning at night on the 27th of May, culminating in a daylight assault on Goose Green. It was the brigade commander's and then the CO's primary concern that no harm should come to the civilian population of Goose Green, whose exact whereabouts were unknown. Hence the deliberate intent to fight on into daylight. The 3 rifle companies and patrol company were to advance on 2 axes, based on known and possible enemy positions. In support, the battalion had a frigate, HMS Arrow, until up to 2 hours before first light. 3 105 guns located at Camilla Creek House, but only 1 section of 81mm mortars. Because of the difficulty of flying sufficient ammunition forward, each company did not have its own dedicated indirect fire unit. A Company pushed enemy in platoon strength off Burnside House at 0635. B Company crossed the isthmus at 0710 and pushed south and west towards Boca House. Despite heavy enemy shelling and small arms fire, the momentum of the advance was maintained. D Company, who encountered an unexpected enemy position on the central axis, were delayed taking it out, and this cost the battalion 1.5 hours of valuable darkness. At first light, the battalion found itself on a line of gorse bushes stretching between Boca House and Darwin Settlement. This just short of the Argentinian main positions, which appeared to be on the Darwin Heights. A fierce trench-by-trench battle developed, with Tupara inching forward by attrition. By first light, HMS Arrow had withdrawn. Mortar ammunition was expended, and weather conditions made artillery adjustment in the close fighting hazardous. For a while it seemed the advantage may well pass to the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel H., moving with his TAC headquarters on the eastern axis, was concerned at the slow progress of A Company, who had fought fiercely for 2.5 hours to gain a foothold on the Darwin Hill feature. Despite brave and spirited attacks by ad hoc sections amongst the gorse bushes, in which both the battalion adjutant and the 2 IC of A Company both lost their lives, the enemy could not be dislodged. At this point, Colonel H. took a personal hand. Unable to use B Company pinned down away to his right, and with D Company still some distance away on the central axis, and himself concerned above everything else over the loss of momentum of his attack, he decided to lead his TAC headquarters forward into the assault to prevent any further delay. And it was while assaulting a hitherto unobserved complex of enemy trenches that he himself was killed. With B Company stalled before Boca House, short of ammunition, and awaiting a direct fire group consisting of a Milan team and GPMGs in the SF role, D Company dropped down onto the seashore and began a flanking attack. One of the Milan missiles fired into the Boca House position caused a terrific explosion, killing a large number of the enemy. This, with the artillery fire and D Company's attack along the foreshore, broke the Argentinian line, and the battalion were able to push on towards Goose Green. A successful, combined, but unplanned C and D Company attack on the schoolhouse just north of the airstrip in the late afternoon, and broad hooking moves by both B and D Company brought the battalion into a position to envelop the defences around Goose Green at last light. With the battalion short of ammunition, and after a successful Harrier strike had taken out the ack-ack gun positions at the end of the Goose Green Peninsula, which were being used in the ground role, acting CO Tupara, Major Chris Keeble, called a halt to forward movement. That night was spent in resting and preparing for action the following day. By dawn, the battalion was ready to fight on if necessary, as ammunition and guns were being brought forward. At first light, 2 Argentinian warrant officer prisoners were sent into the settlement with an ultimatum: to surrender or accept a siege, and in either case, obey the dictates of international law and release the civil population now known to be imprisoned in the community centre. The enemy agreed to surrender. In a bold stroke, Tupara took Goose Green with over 900 Argentinian prisoners. They liberated 112 civilians unharmed. the cost to the battalion themselves, Tupara had lost 17 killed and 35 wounded.
Sergeant Montgomery, who was then a corporal commanding one section of 4 platoon of B Company, will now tell you of his experiences during the battle.
We crossed the start line at 0710. 3 minutes later, the forward section came under fire from about 150 metres away. My section held the fire, as there was a danger of hitting our own troops. However, I told 2 of my men to put up light to assist 2 and 3 section identify the enemy. This was done, and the enemy cleared. We then advanced until we were told to stop, while Company HQ cleared a strong enemy position. And then during the reorganisation phase, the enemy artillery began to shell the positions we had just cleared. This made everyone extremely nervous as it started a bit close to our own position. An hour later, we were ordered to move on. By this time, I didn't have a clue which direction we were going in, and it was a case of follow the sections in front. The big problem was command and control at night. Soldiers were losing contact with their sections as they tend to spread out too far. I found a man from one of the forward sections lying moaning that he had hurt himself in a fall, and after giving him a bit of the good news, he decided to carry on. At first light near Darwin Goose Green Parks, Tracer began action across the sky towards us. We heard A Company make contact at Darwin. Then a machine gun about 700 metres to our left engaged 5 platoon. Then we saw a whole company position to our front. We had obviously surprised them, as there were still quite a few round to the trenches. My section ran to the dead ground, which is about 50 metres away, and once reaching there, we engaged 3 trenches to our front. 2 sections to our right decided to fire a 66 across our heads at the bunker that was giving 5 platoon problems. This was a direct hit and killed the machine gun crew of 3. A few minutes later, we were forced to move back and dig in as the enemy began to increase their fire. Then we heard there was 2 Picara coming in our direction, and that added speed to the digging in. Once their artillery, mortars, and the Picara had a go at us, we heard that 5 platoon was going left flanking. I moved the section forward and began laying down covering fire. Unfortunately, the flanking movement failed. We began taking casualties. This was the way of the battle scene for the next 7 hours. It reminded me of the annual personal weapons test on the ranges. Targets fall when hit, only this time they didn't get back up. When the enemy put down heavy fire, we moved back. When it eased off, we moved forward and opened up with everything we had until gradually we began to win the firefight. As we didn't have any mortar or artillery support of our own, my OC got Milan to engage enemy bunkers. This impressed the enemy so much that they decided to surrender. We pressed on towards Goose Green Airfield and had gone about 900 metres when the forward sections informed us they had found 2 dingbat mines and were in the middle of a minefield. The decision was taken to carry on and hope for the best. Then one of the light anti-aircraft crews decided to try and take us out, but on discovering they couldn't drop their barrels low enough to hit us, their best course of action was to run away. I moved my section to clear that position, while the 2 forward sections moved on to take out an ammunition dump. And on clearing the objective with grenades, taking 1 prisoner, I pushed on to rejoin the platoon. I just reached the ammunition dump when I saw a bunch of enemy soldiers walking towards us, and I immediately placed the section in cover and informed the sergeant major that I believed they wanted to surrender. With the section covering us, the sergeant major and myself moved forward and took the surrender of 17 enemy soldiers. As we were searching them, one RG came across the hill, saw what was happening, panicked, and began to run back towards the high ground. That was until my gunner opened up, put a burst in front of him, then he too stopped and surrendered. After separating the prisoners of war, I was under well-earned smoke when the remaining enemy in Goose Green decided to give us some hard times, and we were subjected to intense small arms fire, which made it impossible to move unless you were in your belt buckle. This continued for quite a while, until they opened up with the 105 howitzers in a direct roll. Again Locke smiled, as they couldn't drop their elevation to hit us. However, the shells passed over just a few feet above. I lay by the side of the track in the ammunition dump and called to my section to crawl away from the ammunition bunkers, which were still full of artillery and mortar shells. The firing died away as enemy fighters approached from the sea, and we were glad to see a Skyhawk shot down by our own troops to the west. We had no sooner finished congratulating ourselves than suddenly a Pucara flew in from behind us. The reaction from everyone was to put up immediate fire at the aircraft, and to our joy, it was hit. This turned to sheer terror as the aircraft banked and crashed about 30 metres from us, the wing taking off an ammunition belt from a man's back without actually injuring him, and spraying us with fuel from its fuel tanks. As darkness fell, we observed one enemy Chinook and 5 or 6 Huey helicopters landing to the south of our position, and we were told that a counterattack was being mounted against us. As we were low in ammunition, our OC ordered us to strip the dead and the ammunition dump of any 7.62 ball and link we could find and withdraw back towards the high ground, and this we did. We began digging in like men possessed with the thought of enemy counterattacks, but alas, it didn't appear, and at first light we spread out and took over the captured positions around our hill, where we dozed and waited. Later in the early afternoon we were informed the garrison at Goose Green had surrendered, and I felt relieved still to be alive, but a little sad for the lads who didn't make it. The battle for Goose Green was over.
The day after Darwin and Goose Green fell, General Jeremy Moore and his staff arrived in San Carlos. The headquarters was established on HMS Fearless on the 29th of May. The General was presented with 3 Commando Brigades plan as it existed, and from it he produced a divisional plan for the final attack on Stanley. Now in the third part of this presentation, we will cover that plan and the action that followed.